In this video, we're going to talk about the process of reflection and provide some tips and ideas on how to make the most of the reflective process. Reflection is something that is absolutely essential to learning. If we just go about tasks in a rote way without actually thinking about them and providing ourselves with that critical commentary as we go of understanding what we do, we don't learn very much at all. And it's that ability to think, to analyse and understand that helps us take things to the next level. And reflection, of course, is not something that is natural to us necessarily. It is something else that is learned, and we learn how to learn through that process of reflection. I've seen the metaphor of under the hood used. It's like trying to figure out what's going on with a car. The best way to do that is to pop the hood and to have a look at the engine and to see what the engine's doing. Although, I mean, yes, that's a American metaphor, but I think if I was trying to talk about flipping the bonnet, we're going to end up in mixed metaphor mode pretty quickly. But anyway, it's the same idea that if you can actually have a look at what the engine working, you can see how it's going on. This is the way in which assessors use reflection in assessment as a way of saying, well, I can't actually sit and watch the student work through a problem. It'd be nice if we could, but universities being what they are, we have large class sizes. We can't sit with every student and watch them work through a problem. But through and if we see the final product, often we can't necessarily see directly how that product was derived. We can guess how it got to be that stage, but it's more difficult to do than if we could actually watch someone do the task or have them describe that for us. So that's what reflection is all about. It's not a touchy-feely, intuitive kind of here's a story about a day I spent at the beach kind of activity. It's a fairly rigorous discussion of your own processes and your problem-solving processes of how you came to a particular point and how that end product was resolved. So it's very useful in the learning process. First of all, it's very useful for you to go through that process because you can learn a lot yourself from that, but it's also useful for a mentor or an assessor or just a peer to be able to observe that reflective process and to be able to give you feedback and to help you understand, well, does that make sense? Are there other ways to thinking about that? It's also clear that reflection is very important for well-being. Non-reflective people tend to be ill more often, and they tend to end up with serious problems around well-being, physical and mental well-being. So when we're talking about reflection, we're not talking about being self-critical. We're not talking about being crippled by doubts and anguish and anxiety. That's not reflection. That's anxiety. Reflection is an honest appraisal of your progress. Like I said, it's a skill you learn. It's not something that comes naturally or necessarily easily. But if you can develop that good balance in the way in which you reflect, then you're actually going to be a lot more stable in the workplace, in your personal life and in yourself, because you're actually able to think honestly and openly about what it is you do, why you do it, and how you do it. And the alternative, of course, is just, and this is where non-reflection, when we end up stressed and we end up in toxic environments and we end up in a situation where there is just too much work stacking up and we believe we don't have time for reflection, or we perform a negative reflection or that anxious kind of self-criticism, that when we end up in those situations, they become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That basically that's not a clear cycle of reflection where we're looking at improvement. We just end up with these terrible thoughts going around and around our heads. So reflection can break that. A good reflective process can actually break out of those destructive cycles and can actually give us pause and time to think clearly, even for a little moment in the workday, about what it is that we're doing. And one of the things, when people ask why don't they reflect, I'm too busy. I have no time to do this. And of course that's, first of all, a wonderful excuse, because we can use that for absolutely anything in our lives. We can be too busy for anything right up until the point at which we die, at which point we have no time left for anything at all. But it's also, I think, Um, in a way, work is always never ending. That's the nature of work. There's always one more customer to see, one more client, one more file to address, one more paper to write. It's the nature of work that's never ending. And if we let that nature of work convince us that it means that we have no time to do anything else because there's always more work, then work is going to crush us. Work is going to be something that we are not going to enjoy or possibly survive because we don't have a way of handling that. We don't find a way of managing that never-ending flow. So we need to be able to handle it for ourselves, and reflection is one way to do that, is to stop the conveyor belt for a moment and say, damn it, this is Thursday afternoon, this is my scheduled reflective time. I'm going to write a diary entry, or I'm going to do whatever it is I do. I'm going to meet with my mentor. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to have a look at where I'm going, what I've learned, how we're going forward. So here's just a list of general tips around reflection and some things to think about with integrating reflection, not only as an assessment task in university assignments, but also as a practice that you can do in your own life and to use in a way that's in a healthy reflective cycle. All right, no particular order to these. First of all, focus on the progress you've made, not the obstacles still before you. This ties into that last point I raised, that work is never ending. It's the nature of work. So when you're reflecting, don't think, my first point of reflection is I still have 3 unwritten papers to finish, plus I promised to do this, plus I promised to do this. Start with what you've achieved in the last cycle. Okay, I've got this done, I've got that done, that's under control. Great. And then you can move on to what your next set of goals are. But always start from a review of the things that you've done, the progress you've made. Second, be honest with yourself. And most people, unless they're sociopaths, tend to be a little bit too far towards the self-critical, and be aware of that. Be aware when you're thinking, oh, I didn't do that very well, and people are going to think I'm an idiot because I did that. Be conscious of the fact that there are those doubts that everyone has. And as I said, apart from sociopaths who have no doubts at all, and if you're a sociopath, you're probably not watching this. But be aware that you may have those negative cycles. Everyone is self-critical, everyone is overcritical, so give yourself a counterpoint, give yourself a devil's advocate on your side to say, hey, but this is what I learned out of the process. Don't make excuses for yourself. You did actually make a mistake. Don't just go, oh, but it's really important. Oh, I made it was someone else's fault. No, own the mistake, but use that process to provide that positive side as well, as say, well, I won't do that again. That's the takeaway from that. Next point, focus on action cycles. Look at what you've done, look at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and look at what that means going forward to the next cycle. This is where a regular reflective cycle can be very beneficial, and again, this can be really useful tied into a mentoring cycle. You meet your mentor every month, you have a discussion with your mentor, and you're able to say, okay, this is what happened last month, going forward to next month, these are the goals that I have. Next point, reflection is a useful place to make connections between theory and practice. One of the things about everyday life is we don't often have much chance to pause and think about theory unless we're maybe an academic and we work in theory, but even then we're not great on the meta theory of thinking about the theory about our theory, if that makes any sense to you at all. So reflection can be a good point at which you can start to understand things like not even only just how the law works and the importance of things like rule of law, but to think about organizational theory or psychology or any of those things, to go, you know what, I've had this experience, and this theory provides a way to help us understand how that works. And that theory might be theory around reflection, and that might be an opportunity for you to think about how reflection has helped you get through that phase. But I think one of the ideas about thinking about reflection as a breather, as a point at which you can go, okay, let's put some walls around us for the hour or whatever time we have for it. Let's not be answering phone calls and emails and texts and all those things, and let's just use that time to focus on the reflection. Is that we can also draw in the that theoretical part as well. Again, it's much easier to justify doing this when you have a mentor, and a mentor is going to be tougher with you in terms of saying things like turn your phone off. You're not answering email. We're just going to have a chat for an hour. You can do it for yourself, but it's easier to do reflection with someone else because they can be tougher than you are. And they can also be tougher when you start making excuses, say, oh, I can't make it this week, I've got a lot of deadlines, all this stuff is going on. And they can say, well, no, you've always got deadlines. It's always a problem. You need to make time for reflective practice. And it's not something you should feel guilty about. Like, oh no, I'm taking time away from work and it's billable hours and it's everything else. Your work, if it's an ethical workplace, will make time for mentoring. And if it's not a workplace that makes time for mentoring, it is a bad workplace and you need to be looking at finding somewhere else to work. There's no two ways about it. Any workplace that starts telling you that, things are more important than your well-being as an employee is a bad, toxic workplace. And they're not going to do you any favours in the long run. Alrighty. So we looked at the theory and practice. Part of this is also using reflection to regain your sense of equilibrium, and I've alluded to this already, and this is why mentors are very useful. That we all get to points in the week where we just feel as though we have no time to do anything, that things are getting out of control. We've lost our ability to meet deadlines on these things, and we're madly just patching things and hoping they come together. Again, it's important to be able to have that time where we can go, okay, a lot of these crises are often, I won't say self-imposed, but they're matters of perception. Is someone going to die or go to jail on the basis of the decisions that you make? Maybe. You might be a doctor, you might be someone who's representing someone in a manner that's very crucial. But let's get some perspective. Most of the things we do will not result in another human being dying or going to jail. They might get disappointed with us, they may get angry with us, but we need to get that sense of perspective. And one of the things of being in a stress cycle is it's often difficult to see your way out of that. And all you see is, oh yeah, but if I do this, and it gets all bound up. So again, mentors are good for this. Mentors can say, hey, reality check this, reality test it. What's the worst that can happen? Okay, that's pretty bad. Your worst case scenario is pretty bad, but is that going to happen? And what are the practical things we can do to stop that happening? So reflection is about breathing space. It's about finding that kind of breathing space to get out of those cycles. All right, let's move on through the list. Use reflection to look at different perspectives on issues and conflicts. Sometimes we can get bound into our preconceptions or the way that we judge people or the way that we don't like people, for instance, and we can see that, X always does this and it's really annoying. And I'm not saying you need to justify what that person does, but you can use a reflection process to understand why it is they do that annoying, terrible thing that they do. So it's not a matter of saying, oh, that's okay that they do that, but it's a matter of being able to provide the understanding of the context. So, Bob's always, undercutting me at meetings and being a real asshole about the things he says and makes sniping comments. Why does he do that? Well, Bob's jealous. He's been in this department for 6 years before I got here and he's going nowhere. Bob sees me as a threat because, I'm doing better work than he does. Now, that doesn't justify Bob's behaviour, but you can actually see from his perspective what he's being motivated by, and you can then sometimes make a strategy on the basis of that. Depending on who Bob is, Bob might be the kind of person who responds to you taking him aside and saying, look, I don't appreciate the comments. What's your problem? Let's have it out. Or Bob might be the kind of person that just is interpreting your behaviour in being threatening. He's seeing what you're doing as being threatening and posturing, and he might be responding in a defensive way because of that. Whatever. There's 1,000 million different combinations here. And what's important is that reflection is a time to actually, again, take a breather, make a space, and to go, okay, is the whole reason this is happening just the way I presumed it to be? Is there a different way of looking at the problem? You also use reflection to focus on now. I've talked about cycles before. I don't have any direct reference for this, but someone somewhere once told me that that depression is about being locked in the past, and anxiety is being about locked in the future, and then neither of which is about being focused on the now. So depression is largely about feelings of shame and unworthiness about what you've done in the past. Anxiety is feelings of fear about what might happen in the future. And one way to avoid those things is to try and exist in the moment now, and to take yourself out of that time, which again is that important of creating of that reflective space as a way of pulling you out of that situation. And it can be useful to have a nice place for reflection. If your mentor has an office outside your organisation, or there's a nice place they want to meet that's a coffee shop, or that's nice and quiet, or a park somewhere, or an environment you really like, it can be nice to have that physical separation and that focus. And there's no time to talk about it here, but that idea of mindfulness, of being in the present and not being consumed by your shame over the past and the things that you think that have gone wrong, nor your anxiety about the future and things that might happen, as to focus on where you are here and now. Now, if your work is solitary, like mine is as an academic, this is where peers and mentors become very, very important. It's very hard when you spend most of your day, reading, writing, marking assignments, doing bureaucratic busy work, to then say, okay, I'm going to make a space out there for myself, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to talk to myself, and I'm going to reflect clearly on what I've done, because I spend most of my time in my work by myself. And a lot of legal work is like that. It's fairly solitary. So that's why having a reflective mentor or a reflective community can be really, really useful. But it also there can be tricks to this. It can be difficult to find. If you can't find someone who is outside your organisation, it can be very easy for a reflective session to quickly turn into a bitching and moaning session. And there are some people who will go there straight away. Every time you have coffee with them, how are you? Oh, God, it happened again. This happened, that happened, what happened? So there are always going to be people who are negative, and you don't want your well-being to hinge on your support network being undermined by this. And you don't want to be in an environment where negative individuals are constantly dragging you down. And even if you are in a negative or toxic workplace, it doesn't necessarily help just to reinforce those problems with people who are already in that same situation, who are suffering from the same thing. So it's important to build reflective networks that are outside of your workplace. Again, a mentor who's outside your workplace is an excellent idea. And it also can be a mistake to mix alcohol and reflection, which, it kind of sounds obvious, but a lot of people, their only reflective time is Friday night drinks with, colleagues, and that can exacerbate all sorts of codependent problems there, where the depressive aspect of the alcohol, the loosening of social mores, people more willing to say things, can end up in a bit of a negative cycle. So I think people who have a very terrible time in the workplace can often make it worse by using inappropriate forums for venting, where you're not going to get help. You're just going to get further stuck in the situation. So again, having a good network, a good mentor, a good reflective practice can, even if you do end up stuck with the negative crowd, it can give you a sense of extra stability for dealing with that. And I guess another thing is to, as you develop as a reflective lawyer and you develop these skills, always model those skills with other people. So you do have someone who is a new staff member who is acting in a way that's unreflective, who seems to be swamped by their work, and they're not thinking through the way in which they act. Model it and show them and say, look, I always set aside Thursday afternoon. Every first Thursday of the month I see my mentor. We go and we talk about this stuff. But every other Thursday I also have a reflective catch-up time where I put aside an hour and I write a diary entry, and I make a list of the things I've done this month and the things I've achieved and things and set my goals. So you can actually, and I think you improve yourself as a reflective person by showing others what you do. And on that last point, and this is the last point of this fairly rambly thing, is making time for reflection. I've mentioned it before, but don't look at reflection as, oh look, when I'm feeling less busy I'll do it, or maybe the week after next I've got a bit of a space in the diary, I'll do it. It has to be something that you make time for. Now, the advantage of a reflective assignment at university is someone's already made time for you, and they've set aside a percentage of marks or whatever to get you to do that activity. But in the real world, you don't have that as an incentive or as a structural way of structuring your reflection, and you need to do that for yourself. You need to actually make specific time. And again, this is where mentors are great, because you can do it as a regular thing, and then they will be able to, if you cancel on them, be able to say, apply a bit of that social pressure to you and say, remember, this is really important. If you're going to cancel this, you need to reschedule it, because it's very important for your own well-being as a practitioner. So anyway, that was a set of different observations around reflection, and I hope what I've been able to do is to connect the idea of reflection that you might do it in a university task as a very small way about describing your learning, to the broader professional context in which it's something which is really closely connected to your well-being and your development and your ongoing skills as a lawyer.